Imagine you can't stand up, not just for a day, for years. Your legs don't answer anymore. One arm barely moves. You can't chew certain foods, can't walk to water, can't run if something growls in the dark. Now take away the parts of your life that make this survivable today. No wheelchair, no hospital bed, no government check arriving every month, no neighbor whose job it is to check on you. Just a small group of people, maybe 20, maybe 30, who have to move constantly to find food, who need every working hand they can get. You can hear them outside, sorting tools, arguing softly about which direction to travel next, deciding, without saying it out loud, what to do about you. Here's the question this video is built around. What happens to you? Do they carry you? Do they leave you? Or does something else happen? Something the popular image of prehistoric life doesn't quite prepare you for. In a hunting and gathering group, contribution isn't optional. It's survival math. Every adult who can't gather, can't carry, can't watch for predators is a mouth that eats without a hand that works. In a bad season, that math can turn deadly for the whole group, not just for the one person who can't pull their weight. So the expectation, the one built into how most people picture prehistoric life, is brutal but simple. The strong survive, the weak get left behind. Think about what that would actually look like in practice. A group that has to relocate every few weeks can't carry someone who can't walk, not for long, not without slowing everyone down at exactly the moments speed matters most. A group facing a lean winter can't spare food for a mouth that isn't also, eventually, a working hand. By that logic, severe and permanent impairment should be one of the fastest ways to vanish from the archaeological record entirely, quietly, early, and without much of a trace. That's the image. This video is going to complicate it, because when researchers actually reconstruct what it takes to keep a severely impaired person alive, someone with no working legs, someone blind in one eye, someone born with a body that will never let them hunt, a different picture starts to show up in the bones themselves. There's a name for this kind of research now. It's called the bioarchaeology of care, a method built specifically to ask one question. What would this particular body have required, day by day, to stay alive this long, and could that have happened without sustained help from other people? The process itself is closer to forensic reconstruction than storytelling. Researchers start with the pathology written into the bone, the fracture pattern, the fused joint, the signs of nerve damage. From that, they build a functional model of what the person could and couldn't do on their own, on any given day, at any given stage of the injury or condition. Then they compare that model against the physical demands of the environment the person actually lived in. How far to the nearest water source? How often the group had to move? How cold the winters got? Where the gap between what this body could do and what this environment demanded is wide enough and lasted long enough. The only way to close it is other people. Around 30 cases like this have been documented in the archaeological record worldwide, spanning tens of thousands of years and more than one species of human. 3 of them make the point especially clearly. Each one also raises a slightly more uncomfortable question than the last. Start with the oldest. Around 50,000 years ago, in a cave in what's now Iraqi Kurdistan, a Neanderthal man died somewhere in his mid-30s to mid-40s. That doesn't sound old, until you know that for a Neanderthal, that's genuinely elderly. Researchers know him as Shanidar I, first uncovered in 1957 during excavations at Shanidar Cave, and decades of reanalysis since then have only added to what his bones reveal. That skeleton tells a rough life. A blow to the head early on likely left him blind in one eye. His right arm was withered and possibly lost below the elbow. His right leg shows signs of a serious, lasting injury. And a detailed 2017 analysis of his ear canals found bone growths severe enough to have caused profound hearing loss, likely for years before he died. Sit with the hearing loss for a second, because it might be the most dangerous injury on that list. A one-armed hunter-gatherer with a limp can still hear a predator moving through the brush in time to run, or shout, or grab a spear. A deaf one can't. The researchers who studied his ear canals concluded that this sensory loss alone would have made him extremely vulnerable in a landscape that still had large predators in it. And yet he lived for years afterward. Long enough for every injury on his skeleton to fully heal. Long enough to become, by Neanderthal standards, an old man. The people who study cases like his are fairly direct about what that implies. Impairment at this level, sustained over this much time, doesn't happen by luck. It happens because other people kept finding food for him, kept warning him of danger he couldn't hear himself, kept him inside the group, instead of letting the group's constant movement leave him behind. And he isn't the only Neanderthal skeleton that tells this kind of story. Researchers who've surveyed older Neanderthal remains more broadly have noted the same pattern showing up again and again. Healed fractures, worn-down joints, old injuries that clearly didn't kill the person at the time they happened. Two researchers who reviewed this pattern back in the early 1980s put it plainly, concluding that at least some Neanderthal groups had reached a point where disabled individuals were, in their words, well cared for by others in their social group. That's not one lucky survivor. That's a pattern showing up across multiple individuals in multiple sites, which is a much harder thing to explain away as coincidence. Now fast forward, not to a different species this time, but to a very different way of life. By around 4,000 years ago, in what's now northern Vietnam, people had stopped moving constantly to follow food. They were farming, they were settling, they were building permanent cemeteries. That shift matters for this story, because settling down changes the math of caregiving in two opposite directions at once. On one hand, a farming village doesn't need to physically relocate someone who can't walk, which removes one of the hardest logistical barriers a nomadic group would have faced. On the other hand, a fixed location means there's no moving on from a bad season, no new territory to walk into if food runs short, which means every extra mouth still has to be justified against a food supply that's often just as fragile as a hunter-gatherer's. In one of those cemeteries, at a site called Man Back, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a young man they refer to as Burial 9, or M9. His bones tell a story that starts about a decade before his death. Sometime in his teenage years, a condition he was likely born with left him paralyzed from the waist down, with only limited use of his arms. And then, according to the skeletal evidence, he lived roughly 10 more years after that. 10 years, unable to walk. Unable for much of that time to fully feed, clean, or reposition himself. The researchers who built the entire framework of the bioarchaeology of care around this exact case modeled out what keeping him alive that long would have actually required. Someone had to move him regularly, or he would have developed pressure sores severe enough to kill on their own. Someone had to feed him by hand, likely every single day. Someone had to manage waste, fight off infection, and keep him warm through years he could not have survived alone. This wasn't a single act of mercy. It was a decade of repeated, unglamorous labor from people who got nothing back from him in the form of hunted meat or planted crops. Picture what that decade actually contained. Someone waking up every morning already thinking about him before thinking about their own tasks for the day. Someone rolling him over at intervals through the night. The same way a modern nurse is trained to reposition a bedridden patient. Except this wasn't training. It was repetition learned by trial and by watching what worked. Someone deciding, thousands of times over 10 years, to keep doing this instead of quietly letting nature take its course, which would have been, by any purely economic measure, the easier choice. Even in death, something about him stood out. Most burials at Manbach were laid flat. He was buried curled, which may simply reflect how his muscles had contracted in life and never released. Or it may reflect something more deliberate about how his community marked him as different, even in the ground. So far, this story sounds tidy. Impaired person, sustained care, a species proving its compassion across 50,000 years. But there's a third case that makes the story much less tidy, and honestly, more interesting. Around 11,000 years ago, in a cave in southern Italy, a teenage boy died with a form of dwarfism that would have left him roughly 4 feet tall as an adult, with restricted movement in his elbows. His remains, known as Romito II, are the oldest confirmed case of this specific condition ever found. He wasn't buried carelessly either. He was found in a double burial alongside an adult who may have been a relative, in a cave decorated with elaborate engravings from the same period, including a large bull carved into the rock. Grave goods were placed with him, ochre and shell ornaments among them, the kind of burial effort a community doesn't typically spend on someone it considered a burden. In the late 1980s, the researcher who first described him in detail argued that his survival into late adolescence was, on its own, proof of group support, since his body would have made typical hunting or heavy physical labor extremely difficult. A few years later, another researcher pushed back hard. Her argument was that surviving into your late teens doesn't necessarily require constant, extraordinary care. It might just mean the group didn't need to expend extra effort. It might mean his condition, while limiting, still allowed him to contribute in smaller ways. And reading every surviving skeleton as proof of tenderness, she warned, risks projecting modern compassion onto evidence that doesn't actually demand it. Here's the detail that makes this case genuinely rare in science. About a decade later, the original researcher who made the first claim reconsidered the evidence and walked it back himself. That's not really a story about who was right. It's a story about how fragile these conclusions can be, and how easy it is to read a skeleton the way we want to read it, instead of the way the bones actually support. So where does that leave the central question? Not with a clean answer. And honestly, that's probably more honest than a clean answer would be. What the evidence does support, across Neanderthals and across 2 very different chapters of Homo sapiens history, is this. There are documented cases, backed by detailed skeletal analysis, of individuals who could not have survived years of total dependency without repeated, sustained effort from the people around them. What the evidence doesn't support is a single, simple motive behind it. It might have been kinship. It might have been social obligation. A sense that you don't abandon someone who was part of the group before they got hurt. It might have involved belief systems that can't be reconstructed from bone alone. It's probably not one single thing across every case, every era, every culture. What stays consistent isn't the reason, it's the behavior. Groups of humans, more than once, in more than one era, chose to keep alive someone who could give almost nothing back. That's a smaller claim than prehistoric humans were compassionate, and it's also a sturdier one. It doesn't require us to know what was happening inside anyone's head 50,000 years ago. It only requires counting what their hands actually did, over and over, for years at a time, and that's something the bones can actually tell us. Compare that to how this works now. Today, if a person becomes unable to walk, unable to feed themselves, unable to work, there's a structure built to absorb that. Hospitals, long-term care facilities, disability insurance, trained professionals whose entire job is to do what once required a whole small community's daily attention. That's a genuine improvement, in one very real sense. You no longer need 20 people to personally, physically keep you alive. You need a system, and the system doesn't get tired, doesn't also need to go hunt dinner, doesn't burn out the way one exhausted caregiver eventually might after a decade. It also doesn't depend on the size of your specific group. A band of 20 people missing even 2 or 3 able-bodied adults could feel that loss immediately, in the food they didn't gather and the danger they didn't spot in time. A modern hospital doesn't run on the personal stamina of the 20 people around you. It runs on shifts, on training that gets passed to strangers instead of just to family, on supply chains that don't care whether your specific neighbors are having a good year or a bad one. But something about the daily, hands-on nature of it got outsourced along the way. What used to be the visible, unavoidable work of an entire group, something everyone in a small band would have witnessed happening every single day, right in front of them, now mostly happens behind hospital doors, in facilities most of us never enter until the day we personally need one. The instinct is probably still in there somewhere. The system is just newer than the instinct is. Go back to that hand from the beginning of this video, the one that can't push itself up off the ground anymore. 50,000 years ago, in a cave, someone else's hand may have reached down and helped a blind, deaf, one-armed man live into old age. 4,000 years ago, in a village that's now part of Vietnam, hands lifted and fed and repositioned a young man for 10 straight years, long after his own legs had stopped working. 11,000 years ago, in a cave in Italy, whatever the true reason was, someone still buried a boy with ochre and shells and placed him next to what might have been family, in a cave they'd already decorated with a bull carved into stone. We don't know exactly why every single time. We just know that again and again someone reached down anyway.